I'm going to start with how my morning started. I started my morning with an email regarding a solar energy contract that would take our company to going 100% renewable. And we're not a very profitable company. We are in a very bad industry, as one of my friends who's sitting in the audience can say. We're a small company, but we're still looking at it. It's no longer, from corporate India, it's no longer a strategic decision of whether or not to go renewable. It becomes a tactical decision. Like, who's going to bear the risk? How long is the tenure? Those kinds of things. But this is a small oasis of hope in a sea of gloom. Arunabha, before I get to what Arunabha said, I'll just say, last year was the hottest year on record. Here we are in JLF, right? We're all wearing linens and cottons instead of silk. It's clearly telling us that the climate has changed. I just finished writing an article on Antarctica where I discovered in the last 300 million years, for the better part of the last 300 million years, Antarctica was forested, right? We're in a very unique place in geological time that allows society and civilization to exist. And just last week, I got an email from a professor, one of the leading climate scientists of India, saying 1.5 degrees is gone, and we don't have a lot of time before the carbon budget to keep our planet within 2 degrees evaporates. So this is an urgent problem. How do we go fossil-free, right? And to give you a scale of the problem, and my panelists will go more into this, fossil fuels, and this is where Arunabha's email helped, fossil fuels account for 90% of India's primary energy consumption today, right? And we have to take that 90% way down if we want to go fossil somewhat free. But we've come a long way, right? If anyone asked about electric vehicles 7 years ago, it was a big joke. And in the next 2 years, two-wheelers may become all electric. I think McKinsey did a survey that said, what's your next car going to be? Almost every two-wheeler owner said, their next vehicle is going to be electric. So it shows you that things can move very, very fast, but with the right incentives, which brings me to my panel. And this is really a fabulous panel because you've got the politician, you've got the policy wonk, and you've got the entrepreneur. And you need these three guys to work together with you, the public, because your votes and what you buy and how you talk really shapes this conversation. So this is the panel, and it is hopefully interactive. The politician, the policy wonk, the entrepreneur, and the public. Okay? And with that, I'm going to come to Sumant. Okay? So Sumant, you've been at this from the very beginning, which gives you a ringside view of how far we've come, how much further you go. So can I ask you to give us a context of the scale of what needs to be achieved and how the nature of challenges from when you began to what now has changed?
Okay, thank you, Mridula. Look, I think the scale of the challenge is simply enormous. I think there's no other way to sugarcoat it. We've developed as humanity a fossil fuel economy over the last 250 years. Okay, it's taken us, all of us working together to create an economy that is based on taking stuff out of the ground, a whole system of user industries that are dependent, whether it's planes, whether it's cars, whether it's ships, whether it is how we power our homes. All of those has been based on the fossil fuel economy, right? And now we have this task of having to change this in a matter of literally the next 20, 30 years. And just uprooting everything and having a much more electric economy and making sure that that electric economy or that electricity is generated through clean sources, right? So it's a pretty enormous challenge. But therein also lies the opportunity for people like us, certainly, because obviously it does mean that there's a lot of work that has to happen, a lot of capital that has to go in, and a lot of business opportunities as well. right? And I'm pretty convinced that given the scale of the challenge, you cannot solve it if it is not commercially attractive. Otherwise, capital just will not go into the sector. Now, you asked me the question of what has changed over the last, let's say, 13, 15 years that I've been in this sector. I think a lot has changed, and there's therefore a lot of scope for and room for us to be optimistic about the future. 15 years ago, climate change was something that people were just beginning to imagine and start thinking about, okay? Today, I think it's front and center, where you have, whenever you have the COP meetings and so on, you obviously have a much higher sense of understanding of this problem globally. And you know, what heartens me is that if you look at this room full of people here, actually it's not a room, of course, the tent full of people here, you'll find that most of them are, I would say, at least 20 years younger in average age than people sitting in other tents in other parts of this festival, right? And that gives me room for optimism that young people today are getting a lot more engaged with this problem than they were earlier. And that, you know, it's in some ways representative of civil society in general being a lot more concerned about this issue. So I think that's in some ways point number one. The second thing is, the second big change that I've seen happen is that technology has moved dramatically over this time period. And it's got to a point now where, at least as far as the electricity part of the energy value chain is concerned, the technology solutions are becoming visible. We just now need to implement them at massive scale, which is a task by itself, but at least we know what the solutions are, and we have to now implement, right? The third thing that is beginning to happen is that electricity represents only a quarter of all carbon emissions, or a quarter of the energy carbon emissions, okay? The rest of it comes from other areas of energy consumption, whether it's heating or mobility or other such areas, heat pumps, etc., right? And so all of that, I think now we are realizing that those problems also have to be solved with a high degree of urgency. Otherwise, we will not be able to meet the carbon budget requirement that we have to stay within. And I think there's a lot of work that is now going on in those areas also. And therefore, there is, I think, at least I'm optimistic, that we will be able to find some of those solutions in the next 10 to 20 years. And then we'll, of course, have to implement at scale. The problem that we all have is that we don't have time. So even 10 to 20 years, while it doesn't seem like it's going to be that long, unfortunately is, as you said, too long for us, because we've already now crossed the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold, right? We all know that. We're sort of heading, if you just look at the pledges that countries have made, we are looking at anywhere from 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade. And mind you, these are only pledges, right? And the action is still much further behind. And so I think the third kind of change that I see happening is that the energy transition now has become mainstream. Earlier when I started, it was a kind of a niche sector. A few companies were playing in it or getting involved in it. But now you find that everybody now recognizes that this is the next big economic opportunity or business opportunity. And so you see a lot of people coming into the sector. And that is really good, because you need all hands on deck. You need everybody to be coming in with their capital, with their execution ability to solve these problems. And I think that is really very, very positive. So when I started, we were very few of us who were doing this. Today, I think there are many more people who are doing this, and that's great. It obviously means more competition for us, but I think it's good for humanity. And there are many more people now seized of the problem who are hopefully going to get into this sector over a period of time and help solve this problem, whether it's from technology or implementation or just creating the pressure on civil society, whether it's politicians or policy wonks or whatever, or people like me, to make the change happen a lot faster. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sumant. And Arunabha, all good, but all of this, the enormous transition needs a lot of money, okay? And there's also geopolitics involved, including the one word that gets everyone to sit up a little straighter, which is China. So can you give us a sense of the kind of financial challenges that such a transition is going to take, and the geopolitical challenges of making that happen.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mridula. And you left yourself out in, pointing out to Malcolm, Sumant, and myself, but your own work, your own writings, but your own actions are very much part of the solution set. But thank you also to JLF for naming this panel after Sumant's book, Fossil Free, and my book, Energizing India. So it's great to be in this conversation. You started the question by saying all good. Yes, I mean, all good in the sense that Sumant highlighted the church is, the tent is becoming bigger. We need a broader church within which we can all participate. But what's not clear right now is what are these different pathways through which individual companies or countries or groups of countries are going to act. So setting a target, whether you're trying to limit to 1.5 or 2 or 2.5 is one thing. Getting it done is a different thing altogether. Right? So in the getting it done stuff, I put it as a money, materials, and manpower challenge. Right? So let's start with money in the first case. India alone, this decade, will need to invest at least $200 billion in clean energy infrastructure alone. If you look at its electric vehicle ambitions, that is another market of about $206 billion. If you look at its green hydrogen targets, that's another investment opportunity of about $100 to $140 billion. Add it all up, India's offering an investment opportunity of over $500 billion of investments this decade alone. But on the flip side, you've got to ask how much is actually flowing into India. So notwithstanding the human service that Renew and others are doing, in total, we are attracting anywhere between $15 to $18 billion annually. Now we need to up that game at least 2x, 3x perhaps every year for every year until the remainder of this decade. Compare that to the rest of the world, right? The bulk of capital is still circulating in capital-rich regions. Now, I at least originally studied as an economist, and my econ professor told me there's law of supply and demand, but the next thing is that capital flows from capital-rich to capital-poor regions, and labor goes in the other direction. So I want my university fees back because capital is circulating in the capital-rich regions. Now, that's happening for reasons of risk, etc. But the point is, it highlights that where the sun shines the most, that's not where money is flowing. So if we care about India's energy transition, if we care about the growth of Indian companies in this sector, and if we care about the planet, it is the single most important thing we've got to solve for in trying to bring capital into this.
How will we get the money in?
Now, one of the ways to do this is, of course, to have clearer and longer term and unchangeable policies where there's no backtracking, no stress that this policy direction will change, and more importantly, that if you're signing a contract, you're going to get paid. Right? There are ways to de-risk that as well. And I think one of the institutional innovations that India did in creating the Solar Energy Corporation of India was something that many other countries had not done, which did reduce a degree of the risk that entrepreneurs faced by absorbing that risk and keeping the DISCOM separate. But there's more to be done. There's macroeconomic risk that's not in the hands of an individual entrepreneur. So if the US Fed raises interest rates, then dollar-denominated debt taken by an Indian company, the cost of that finance goes up. Nothing has changed here. The policy hasn't changed, the entrepreneur hasn't changed, the land banks haven't changed. Nothing has changed except your cost of finance has gone up, which is why under India's G20 presidency, a lot of focus was on how do you reform the multilateral development banks to be bigger, bolder, and better in dealing with these macroeconomic risks. But very quickly, there are those two other challenges as well, not just the money part, because we can count the trillions. We need maybe $5.96 trillion, but there's over $200 trillion of institutional capital sitting in the world. So that's 2%. So it's about finding the right incentives. So there are other bottlenecks that are actually also quite real. The materials part, right? India today is importing well over 80% of its solar panels. 92% of those are coming from China and Hong Kong. Right? If India goes from about 70 gigawatts of solar to, say, 200, 250 gigawatts of solar, another 150 or 200 gigawatts of wind, overall about 500 gigs of non-fossil capacity by the end of the decade, you've got to ask yourself, will this level of dependence give comfort to a policymaker or to a politician? So it makes sense to start thinking about the global value chain in clean energy products and services. What we've seen is that over the past decade, as countries have become more ambitious about clean energy, their dependence has grown. For solar, from less than 40 countries to over 70 countries, for lithium batteries from 19 to 48. So a number of countries across the world are worried about this. And finally, on manpower, we estimate that we'll need at least 1 million people in the workforce just for our 2030 targets. But there's a potential for over 60 million jobs to be created in the broader sustainability paradigm for India. So whether you are an entrepreneur, an investor, a critical minerals miner, or an educationist, the church and the tent is widening. You just got to come and participate.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the one word I heard repeated again and again is incentives. And Malcolm, you gave me a fabulous quote. He gave me a really fabulous quote. Day before yesterday, and he said, this is a problem. This going fossil free is a problem that's going to be solved by engineering and economics and not by ideology or idiocy. And it's so great, I'm going to repeat it. It's solved by engineering and economics, not by ideology and idiots. So coming to steady policy, we both have coal as a country, and there is a political constituency that supports that. How do you get the political support to craft the kind of steady policy? What are the political bottlenecks? How do you see this problem?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And again, thank you all for assembling this panel, and my friends here who are working so hard for the global challenge. Look, let me cut right to the chase. In my country, Australia, it is no longer economic to build a coal-fired power station. If you wanted to have a new source of generation, you would not build a coal-fired power station. We still have coal-fired power stations, but they are going out of business rapidly, and sometimes too rapidly, because obviously if you have a 1,500 megawatt power station that closes down, you've got to be able to back it up with something else. The cheapest form of new generation in most parts of the world is solar power, followed by wind, but it has to be backed up. And I think India has the world's leading national policy on pumped hydro. And as president of the International Hydropower Association and a pumped hydro developer myself with my wife Lucy, I really applaud that and admire it, and I hope other countries follow it. Look, we have the tools to do this job. We can have cheaper electricity, cheaper energy, and low emission or zero emission energy. In Australia, we had an insane political debate for years in which the existence of climate change was turned into an identity issue. That's still very much the case in the United States. Donald Trump says it's a hoax. Let me tell you, saying you believe or disbelieve in global warming is like saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. Step out of the second floor window and test your state of belief about gravity. You'll find physics has no interest in your opinion, none at all. And so I think that battle is more or less over in Australia. But what is becoming increasingly apparent is that people understand renewables deliver cheaper electricity. And one of the reasons they understand that is because we've had a massive rollout of rooftop solar. Do you know nearly a third of all the homes in Australia have solar panels on them? we're installing well over 2 gigawatts of rooftop solar alone. Nearly 300,000 houses a year are getting, new houses are getting, or new installations are getting it. So that's the challenge. We've got the tools, we can do the job, and I think politicians have got to be able to make the point. You can save the planet, cut emissions, and have cheaper electricity, but you've got to get on and build it, particularly the hydro. Takes time. Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. You have to get on with it, and that's why I got the big snowy project you mentioned earlier, Mridula earlier. Sorry, I'm tripping over your name. I apologise. But that's why I got that going some years ago. These things take time, but we have the tools on the table to do the job. We just have to get on with it. And the challenge in India is gigantic, possibly the most gigantic in the world, but I really applaud the vision and the commitment of your government, with Sumant and Arunabha and so many others, I'm sure you'll get there.
Sumant, coming back to you, see, you really have the ringside view. At the end of the day, the rest of us are all either using your product, advocating your product, or enabling your product, but you're doing it. So what gives you, I have a 3-part question, and given the time, I'd like each of you to keep time in mind. 3-part question. What gives you the most hope? What keeps you up at night? And what is your ask from the audience?
Okay, so what gives me hope? What gives me hope is, I think the pace at which technology is advancing. It is terrific, and I think, therefore, solutions are becoming available much faster than we'd anticipated. And technology is driving costs down for clean energy, and therefore it makes it much more commercially attractive, and therefore is able to drive in more capital into the solutioning, right? So that is what makes me the most optimistic. What is it that keeps me up at night? Actually, not much. I sleep quite well. But I know what you're trying to ask, which is what worries me the most, so I won't take it literally. So what keeps me awake at night, or what worries me about this whole thing, is that there are just too many people in the world who don't believe in the laws of physics, unfortunately, right? And to put it very bluntly, I mean, there is an election happening in the US this year, right, which is going to have probably the biggest impact on climate change efforts over the next 4 years at least, right? And may either set us on the right path or may set us back entirely. And the tragedy is that maybe there are 65, 70 million people who vote for Donald Trump. Okay, that's 1% of the world's population. That 1% of the world's population can hold the rest of the world hostage on climate change efforts, because it can take the entire US economy, which is 1/5 of global GDP, out, and all the leadership that comes along with it out of climate change efforts. So to me, that really worries me, actually, because it is a big issue that none of us have any control over. And unfortunately, climate change is one of the many topics under discussion at this election, right? And it therefore gets subsumed under a lot of other things and so on. What I want from the people here is I want participation. I want people here to really rise up and say, we will not accept this any longer. We need to have change. And for example, in India, the good news for us is that the Indian government is already doing a lot, right? But are Indian corporates doing enough? Is Indian media writing enough? And I think the answer to all of that is perhaps not as much as they should be, right? And I especially want the young folks here to treat the opportunity of working in our sector very seriously. It is going to be great for their careers, but it's also going to be something that is going to be meaningful and give you a high sense of impact in your lives and your careers. It's far better than selling soap. Okay, so therefore I really want participation of the young folks in the audience here, and actually everybody in the audience.
Well said.
Same questions.
Same questions.
Let me answer in reverse order. Um, what do I want from the folks here? To build on what Sumant just said, participation. I think we just got to get ourselves to be a lot more aware of what's going on. And I think we often limit ourselves by thinking this is an externally imposed issue, that some international negotiations are figuring this out, and then we are stuck with this. We are experiencing climate change as we speak. You said this right at the outset. Just 2 weeks ago at CEW, we published the first tehsil level, means sub-district level analysis of precipitation. And we see that over the last 40 years, more than 11% of the 4,600 tehsils we have in the country are showing a decline in the southwest monsoons, exactly in those months where we are sowing those crops. This is a lived reality. And then there's heat stress, and then there's the rest. Let's just educate ourselves that this is part of our own development strategy, not something somebody else is telling us to do. What keeps me awake at night, I don't sleep as well as Sumant, my wife sleeps far better than I do. What keeps me awake is actually a lack of imagination. I think we are stuck in this paradigm that the energy system needs to look like Nikola Tesla thought about it in the late 19th century. The transformer in the late 1890s looks exactly the same as now. But in the 2090s or even the 2050s, it's going to be fundamentally different because we're going to have a distributed energy infrastructure. Just 2 weeks ago, we've got an announcement of 10 million homes in India to get rooftop solar. That's 30 gigawatts of additional solar capacity coming on stream. That combined with electric vehicle charging, combined with district heating, cooling, combined with combining our decarbonisation revolution and our digitalization revolution to see how the electrons and the bytes interact with each other is a completely different way in which we will live, eat, work, travel, and enjoy ourselves. That's the lack of imagination that's holding us back. And therefore, what gives me hope? It's how do we get the energy transition closer to people? This cannot be just a centralized policy-making story. In my hand, I've got a block of wood or whatever you call it, but it's made from agricultural waste, the same stuff we otherwise burn and get air pollution. But I also have something that my colleagues at CEW have invented with small entrepreneurs making brass. This is a block of green brass, which has melted brass in India for the first time in a furnace we've developed at 1200 Celsius without coal, 55% lower emissions. But it's a solution that works for tiny enterprises, not for the big guys. And unless we bring the energy transition closer to people, to make this part of their lived reality, to make them feel that they are empowering themselves with new forms of power, we will limit ourselves into thinking that climate change is out there, international negotiations are out there, and this is just a panel discussion I can forget.
Right. Well, look, I agree with everything they said. I just say the thing that doesn't really. I sleep well too, by the way. But the thing that I'm concerned about is just delays, permitting problems, planning problems. Delays in actually getting the infrastructure we need built. I mean, China obviously doesn't face those problems. They've got a different society, and that's why they're building more renewables than the rest of the world put together.
Malcolm, I actually thought your ask of the people was, please vote for me.
Yeah, well, I was going. Okay, well, I'm no longer running. I'm not a candidate, but actually, that's a really good point. A really good point, and I think the way I'd frame it is this. A lot of people will say, "What can I do about climate?" And they'll say, "Oh, well, drive less, fly less, whatever, recycle your waste, etc." All of that's good. But the single most important thing is to vote for candidates and parties that will support strong climate action. Make your vote count. So thank you.
So we're coming to the end, and I'm just going to wrap up with, it's been a terrific panel. And if I summarize what I took away, we need a lot of money, but we have a model that works. And this is something you said yesterday as well. I mean, a lot of the technology we need is already available. Let's not go hunting out and give other people the chance to say, well, let's wait for that. It's already available. But we need, yeah, but we need people here to buy renewable power, to vote for politicians, who create policies that make that happen, and to join institutions that create policy. And from my side, I'll give you a bit of hope. It's a personal story. Friend is sitting there. When I started writing on climate change, my family was quite disapproving. They thought it was a midlife crisis gone badly wrong. Today, they treat me with respect. I invest in climate change startups, and the interest is going up like this. EcoWrap is a company I'm looking at. There are companies all around, started by young and old people. People over 45, 50, 60, people are starting and doing it. So please go ahead.
People that old?
Yeah. My oldest founder is 72. So with that, we've run out of time. Oh,
No, we've got 10 more minutes.
You're so good, we've been given 10 more minutes.
Yeah. We've got
for Q&A. Yeah, Q&A. So questions. Wow, that's a lot. So the lady in blue, and then the gentleman in black, and then the lady next to him, and then the gentleman in front, and then we'll go to the back.
Hi,
But just questions, please.
thank you very much for this. So I have two questions. You can choose to answer any one. Carbon offsetting is a great idea, and it's required for industries which cannot be decarbonized. But what's the scope for greenwashing, and what are the safeguards against it? And second question, how do we reconcile the fossil fuel subsidies that we have in our country with the clean energy transition that we're talking about?
Great questions.
Thank you.
Can we just get a couple more, and then we'll, yeah. The gentleman over there, and then I'm going to go to one person in the back. Yeah.
Australia's been named and shamed as one of the worst countries in the world when it comes to climate change. And the party that was responsible for our terrible, I'm Australian, our terrible policies was the Liberal Party, full of climate change deniers. And that's actually the party that...
So the question, please?
The question is to Malcolm Turnbull, while you were Prime Minister of Australia, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you actually shut down more of the coal-fired power stations? Why didn't you stop the mining of coal and the exportation of coal?
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman in the back.
India has the largest engineering, it's kind of a manufacturing hub for engineers, but they don't stay. So how do you make the engineers want to stay in engineering and solving these problems for India in India?
Okay, so we'll get a round of answers. Greenwashing, subsidies, Australia, and then how do we get engineers to actually do engineering? So, do you want to take?
Okay, so greenwashing, I think the issue is it's a legitimate concern. There are way too many companies and people out there making all sorts of claims. What we require is we need proper validation. We should not let any claim go untested, right? So we need validating agencies that can actually say, yes, this is right, this is wrong. And similarly on carbon offsets as well, you're right, we need carbon offsets because not everything can be made to zero. So for carbon offsets, we do need to make sure that we have the right projects in place and that the companies that are doing them are in fact high quality companies, not people who are just trying to make a fast buck. And again, we need validating agencies that are able to certify that these carbon credits truly are being generated. So that's in fact what has set back this whole industry, because in recent months and years, there's concern about how good the quality is of these carbon credits. So I think the industry is going through a bit of a churn right now to improve the quality of these carbon credits, which I think is certainly happening. And therefore, over a period of the next few years, you'll probably see the quality of carbon credits improve. But nevertheless, we have to be very conscious of not letting people make claims. For example, Apple said they're going to make their Apple watches, have a certain amount of carbon footprint and so on. So those things have to really be validated. We can't just let people just make suo moto statements like that.
I'll just add one thing to that. That's where you guys come in. Really, all of us, we just need to call it out. And just recognize it's a process. Like, don't give the dog a bad name and hang him, but it's a process, but do call it out. On the engineers, or Malcolm, your tougher
All right,
question?
well, let me talk about Australia. Australia has suffered, Australian politics has suffered from what we called the climate wars. It's exactly what's still going on in the United States. I think it's largely over in Australia. I'm one of the few politicians who can say he lost the leadership of his party twice over this issue because of opponents who were essentially mostly in the climate denial camp. Having said that, nonetheless, there is a lot happening in Australia. There's a huge rollout of solar, a big rollout now of pumped hydro. Electricity emissions relating to electricity are coming down. Our overall emissions have not come down, and that is because of exporting natural gas. So there are people that argue that natural gas is a transition fuel. We obviously export coal as well, including to India, but gas, methane, has fewer emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions, than, say, burning coal. But the problem with methane is the fugitive emissions are a much greater heating effect on the atmosphere than CO2 itself. So it's not exactly. I don't think it's the solution that people saw it as. But the bottom line is, if Australia stopped exporting coal, assuming it was within the government's power to do that, and it wanted to commit political suicide and ban it, and I have to say, over my years in politics, I've always welcomed suggestions to me to commit political suicide. And I can just say that when you're out of office, you can't do anything at all. Remember a great political line, there are none so pure as the impotent. And so you've got to be able to stay in office to do anything. But the reality is, if we stopped exporting coal, Colombia and other countries Indonesia would just export more. What is driving decarbonisation is action within the customer countries, whether it's internal, China's a massive coal producer like India, or indeed countries which do consume some coal but export most of it, like Australia.
Thanks, Malcolm, for the candid answer. 30 seconds, Arunabha.
30 seconds. India reduced its fossil fuel subsidies by 72% between 2014 and 2021, according to calculations that my colleagues have done at CEW. But in 2021, our fossil fuel subsidies were 9 times that of our renewable energy subsidies. So while we are making a big progress, we also still have distorted markets. So the best way to start fixing this is going back to consumption behavior. The more we want to buy diesel SUVs, then we wonder why our electric vehicles are not going to be sold. But then actually, if you look at real-time sales, we sold about 1,400 electric vehicles in 2014. Our real-time EV dashboard shows this year already 1.38 million EVs sold in India. So let your actions speak before your words, and let your words hold the policymakers and the politicians and the entrepreneurs to account.
Thank you. And in ending this, I'll always say, when I started writing, that getting fossil fuel emissions down was always the more hopeful part of the climate story for me. So I actually say, look, it's irresponsible where we are if we don't adapt. And if you doubt me, just feel your sweat in February in Jaipur, and that will tell you we have to start adapting as well. Thank you so much. It's a fabulous panel. Thank you.